Okay, some time ago I did a write-up on my website at meattrapper.com about fishing yo-yos, and I believe the post was called Fishing Yo-Yos, Gear or Gimmicks. And basically the idea was to evaluate fishing yo-yos and decide if they were useful, functional pieces of gear, or if they were gimmicks that really didn't add value and simply cost money. And overall, my opinion of the fishing yo-yo was not that good. And what I did is I ran a few tests. I used the yo-yos out in the field, and when I evaluated what I got from using the yo-yo versus what the yo-yo cost and some of the troubles that I had with the yo-yos, overall the bad outweighed the good. And once I published that, I got some feedback, and I had several people contact me and urge me to reevaluate my findings. So one of the first things I did is I noticed every time I went to order yo-yos, there were two different versions of fishing yo-yos. There was what's called the mechanical fisher, and then there was what's called the white auto fisher. And I couldn't really tell a whole lot of difference between the two. Both of them were made in the same factory in Arkansas, basically out of the same materials. They had a little bit different design, a little bit different trigger, but I really couldn't tell a whole lot of difference between them. And I ran across a YouTube channel from a fellow named Hogwild who actually sells these yo-yos, and he had done probably the best comparison video between the two models and what was different between the two. And that really piqued my interest, because the yo-yo model that I originally purchased and evaluated was the mechanical fisher. So I got to thinking, well, what if there's some differences between these two versions of yo-yos, and what if those differences would have an impact on the outcome of my tests. So in addition to the dozen mechanical fishers that I ordered, I recently ordered half a dozen White's auto fishers from Hogwild, and I highly recommend the guy as a vendor. Shipping was very fast, product was delivered on time, and it was as described. Had no problems whatsoever. So if you need yo-yos, I'd check out a fellow named Hogwild. You can find him on YouTube. Did a great job. So anyway, as far as the specifics, let's get into a comparison of the mechanical fisher versus the White's auto fisher. Now, Hogwild does a version of this on his channel, and I understand that he sells both products, so he gives them an even review. What I'm going to tell you is my experiences with the two, and based on my experiences, there's no comparison between the two versions. And this was triggered by a comment that he made, where he stated on his channel that he was still using White's auto fishers that were used by his father and grandfather. They were 30 years old and they were still being used. And that really caught my attention, because one of the first things that I noticed with the mechanical fisher was what I would call quality control issues. Now, this right here is a mechanical fisher yo-yo, and this was not purchased from Hogwild. This was purchased from another vendor. And out of the dozen that I ordered, this one right here had definite quality control issues. And the first thing I want you to notice is the spring. Now, I've unwound the cord to keep it untangled and out of the way. But if you look at the spring tension, when I wind this up and I let go, notice how it coils and then it uncoils. Look at that. There's just not a whole lot of spring pressure there. There's not a whole lot of tension there. Now I want you to compare this to a White's yo-yo, White's auto fisher. Now when I uncoil it, it snaps back. There's no comparison there. The next thing I want you to look at is, hopefully this will show up on the video. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Look at how uneven the coils are on the spring. There's a gap between the coils on this spring of greater than a quarter of an inch. Sometimes it's close to a half an inch between coils on the spring. There's simply very little pressure, very little tension on this spring. This is a really bad spring. I think you can see that. Notice how uneven the spring is coiled. Notice how there's gaps between the coils of up to a quarter of an inch. There, I think you can see that right there. I mean, this is just unacceptable. Look at the play in that. Now look at the play in the face. You can tell there's just a lack of quality control in this unit. Now I realize it's just a yo-yo. I realize it's just one yo-yo out of a dozen, but this spring is clearly inferior. And when you compare it to the White's Auto Fisher, look at how uniform the spring coils are. Now this is a carbon steel spring in the White's Auto Fisher compared to a stainless steel spring in the mechanical Fisher. So this spring can rust, and you will have to maintain this spring and oil it. But in my opinion, this spring is far, far superior to the spring in the mechanical Fisher. There's no comparison between the White's Auto Fisher and the mechanical Fisher when it comes to the spring. No comparison at all. One of the primary reasons for using a yo-yo is for the spring and for its ability to set a hook and play the fish. So to me, to buy a yo-yo with an inferior spring is defeating the purpose entirely. It makes no sense to buy a spring-operated fishing unit that has a bad spring. I mean, right there, my vote goes to the White's Auto Fisher. But there's a little extra here, and let's take a look. They have two different types of triggers. The mechanical Fisher has a flat trigger right here, and it's basically a teeter-totter design. It's a flat trigger. It has a pivot point that's a rivet in the center. Now, there are two notches, one on each side of the reel. One is deep and one is shallow. And the deep notch provides for a firmer tension. It takes more pressure from the fish to release it, whereas the shallower notch, being shallower, requires less tension to set it off. This is nice, but one of the things that I know as a trapper is that the more power or more pressure that's exerted by the spring the harder the pan tension is. In other words, the more force it's going to take to release and capture a fish. One of the big criticisms that I had about the yo-yo was that it's a one-shot Charlie. It's a one-shot deal. You have your bait and your hook in the water, and if a tiny bluegill comes up and nibbles the bait but doesn't take the bait, if it trips the trigger, the spring coils up and it yanks the bait up out of the water, and then you're done. You don't have a bait in the water. You don't have a hook in the water, so it's over with. There's no chance of making a catch because your hook and your bait are up out of the water. So pan tension or trigger tension is critical. And with a weak spring, you have a weak pan tension, and that means it takes less pressure to activate it, less pressure to set it off. The White's Fisher, on the other hand, has a much stronger spring, and it takes more pressure to activate than the mechanical Fisher does. That means it's going to take more pulling from the fish. The fish is going to have to pull on it harder, which means that your chances of a misfire, your chances of a small bluegill nibbling at the hook and tripping the trap and having the hook and the bait pull up out of the water are much less. Now, I've actually done some experiments with putting weights on the end of these triggers to verify this, and I've verified that the pan tension or the trip tension on the White's Auto Fisher is much higher than it is on the mechanical Fisher. So I have a lot more confidence in this unit than I do the mechanical Fisher. The third advantage that the White's Auto Fisher has over the mechanical Fisher is the little tab that you see here where you attach a cord. If you'll notice, I've got some cord here that is approximately the same size as 550 cord, and it goes through the hole in the tab just fine. Now, if you take a look at the mechanical Fisher, you'll see I have a much smaller piece of twine tied through the hole. This is some tarred bank line right here that I have, and that's because the hole in the mechanical Fisher tab right here is smaller than the hole in the Auto Fisher tab. So if you're packing these for a survival kit, and if your cordage that you're packing with you is 550 cord or something similar to that in diameter, if you get out in the field and you have a mechanical Fisher, you're not going to be able to use your 550 cord on this unless you open the hole up. And if you'll notice by the location of the hole, it's right on the edge, it's right in the corner. So you really don't have a whole lot of room to make this hole bigger. Whereas the White's Auto Fisher has a much bigger hole. There's no problem using 550 cord on that. So overall, for my money, I'm going to use the White's Auto Fisher over the mechanical Fisher every time. It's got a better spring, it's got a stronger spring, it's able to be used with a wider variety of cordage right off the bat than the mechanical Fisher is. And when it comes to the efficiency of the trigger, a lot's been made out of the flat trigger versus the wire trigger on the White's Auto Fisher, but I don't really see a big difference between the two. One thing that is certain with the flat trigger, there's no way to adjust the tension of this trigger whatsoever. It's riveted on, and you can't make that rivet tighter or looser. Whereas with the trigger that's on the White's Auto Fisher, I may not be able to make it looser, but I can always crimp that down with a pair of pliers right there, and I can increase the pan tension or the trigger tension. So anyway, those are the two versions of the yo-yos. We have the mechanical Fisher, we have the White's Auto Fisher. They're both made in Arkansas, both made in the same factory. The difference primarily is the spring and the way that that it attaches to a cord. And for my money, I'll go with the White's Auto Fisher every time. To me, it's a better piece of equipment. It takes a little bit more in the way of maintenance. You're going to have to oil it. It's not stained. The spring isn't stainless steel. but that's a minor trade-off for all of the advantages that you get. So I hope this has been of use. And one other thing, as far as the one-shot Charlie aspect that I mentioned, whereas if a fish trips the trigger, the yo-yo winds up and it pulls your hook and your bait up out of the water and you're no longer fishing. I've got a way around that, and I'll share that in a later video. But basically it involves suspending the yo-yo down in the water and suspending a longer line beneath your first swivel here. But we'll do that in a later video. Thanks a lot. I hope this has been of value to you.